The October wind, tearing through the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, was not gentle. It was a golden, thrashing thing, stripping the elm trees of their dying leaves and plastering them against the wrought iron fences of the brownstones. It was a beautiful, violent autumn, the kind that made the city look like it was burning in amber light. But for Sedona, the wind was just another reminder that winter was coming, and her coat was too thin. Sedona walked with her head down against the gust, her boots scuffing against the uneven brick of Acorn Street. At 26, she had become a ghost in this neighborhood. She possessed the keys to 12 of the most expensive homes in Boston, yet she owned nothing but a bicycle and a studio apartment in Allston that smelled perpetually of damp wool. She was the dog walker. To the residents of the Hill, she was a utility, as necessary and invisible as the street lamps. She knew which senator's wife was hiding vodka bottles in the recycling. She knew which investment banker was sleeping in the guest room. She knew these secrets because animals do not lie, and neither do the houses when the owners are away. But there was one house that kept its secrets better than the others. The Harrington Estate stood at the top of a hill, a formidable structure of red brick and black shutters that seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. It was the home of Levi Harrington, a name that used to appear on concert hall marquees in Paris and Vienna, but now only appeared on the brass plaque by the door. Sedona paused at the gate, checking her watch. It was 10 a.m. sharp. She punched the code into the keypad. The heavy iron gate clicked open. Inside, the house was silent. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a held breath. The foyer was vast, smelling of lemon polish and cold stone. Sedona moved quietly, hanging her scarf on the rack. She wasn't here for the art or the history. She was here for Atlas. Atlas appeared from the shadows of the hallway, a massive, sleek Doberman with cropped ears and eyes that watched her with a frightening intelligence. To the world, Atlas was a weapon, a guard dog purchased to keep the public away from the reclusive genius. To Sedona, he was a lonely soul trapped in a velvet prison. "Hey, buddy," Sedona whispered, crouching down. The dog didn't bark. He simply pressed his heavy head against her chest, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Sedona buried her hands in his fur, feeling the tension in the animal's body. We mistake the leash for safety, forgetting that the only thing keeping us from running wild is the fear that no one will come looking for us if we get lost. She clipped the leather let onto his collar. Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence. It was a piano chord, discordant, violent. A cluster of notes slammed together with enough force to vibrate the floorboards beneath Sedona's boots. Then silence again. Sedona froze. Levi was usually hidden away in the upper levels, invisible. She had worked here for 4 months and had only seen him once, a silhouette watching from a window. He was a phantom, a rumor of a man who had stopped playing music 3 years ago after a tragedy the tabloids never quite figured out. But today he was downstairs. The double doors to the grand music room were slightly ajar. Atlas whined, pulling gently toward the sound. Against her better judgment, against the strict clause in her contract that demanded absolute invisibility, Sedona took a step toward the doors. She peered through the crack. The room was bathed in the harsh, white morning light pouring through the uncurtained windows. In the center sat a grand Steinway, its lid open like a black wing. And sitting on the bench, with his back to her, was Levi. He wasn't the elderly eccentric she had imagined from the neighborhood gossip. He was young, perhaps 32, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He wore a heavy gray sweater that looked expensive but neglected. He wasn't playing. He was staring at his hands. They hovered over the keys, trembling. He looked like a man trying to dismantle a bomb, terrified that the next movement would destroy him. "It's wrong," Levi whispered. His voice was a low rasp, unused and rough. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was speaking to the air. "It's all wrong." He slammed the fallboard of the piano shut. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Atlas barked. a sharp, protective sound. Levi spun around on the bench. For the first time, Sedona saw his face. He was strikingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a jawline that could cut glass, but his eyes were haunted. They were the color of storm clouds, dark and turbulent, and currently wide with shock at finding an intruder in his sanctuary. "I didn't hear you come in," Levi said. He stood up abruptly, knocking the piano bench back. He looked at her mouth as she spoke, his gaze intense, focused. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington," Sedona said, tightening her grip on the leash, her heart hammering. "Atlas heard the noise. I didn't mean to disturb you." Levi stared at her. He looked at the leash in her hand. He looked at the dog, who was wagging his tail, a traitor to his master's isolation. "Disturb me." Levi let out a dry, humorless laugh. He walked toward her, stepping out of the halo of sunlight into the gloom of the hallway. He stopped 3 feet away. He smelled of old sheet music, coffee, and a profound, aching loneliness. "You can't disturb a ghost, miss." He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. He had signed her checks, but he had never learned her name. "Sedona," she whispered. "Sedona," Levi repeated. He watched her lips move, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were trying to decipher a code. "Like the desert." "Like the city," she corrected, though she felt more like a wasteland under his scrutiny. He looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He seemed to be searching for something: disgust, pity, fear. He was used to people looking at him with awe or confusion. But Sedona just looked at him with the same soft, open expression she gave the dog. "Take him," Levi said suddenly, turning his back on her, retreating toward the silence of the piano. "Take him out. He hates the noise. And frankly, so do I." He didn't wait for a response. He walked back to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass, shutting her out. Sedona stood there, trembling not from the cold, but from the heat of his gaze that lingered even after he turned away. She realized then that the leash in her hand wasn't just holding the dog. It was the only thing connecting the man in the tower to the world he had abandoned. She turned and walked Atlas out into the windy street, but for the first time, the heavy door of the Harrington Estate didn't feel like it was closing behind her. It felt like it was waiting for her to come back. November descended upon Boston like a closing shutter. The golden light of October turned into a steel-gray resolve, stripping the last of the leaves from the trees on Beacon Hill and leaving the branches bare, scratching against the sky like skeletal fingers. For Sedona, the cold was an intruder. It seeped through the thin soles of her boots and found the tear in the lining of her coat. But inside the Harrington Estate, the cold was different. It was architectural. It lived in the high ceilings and the marble floors, a chill that no amount of central heating could displace because it radiated from the owner himself. The routine had shifted, subtly but undeniably. In the weeks following their first meeting, Levi had stopped hiding in the shadows of the upper floors. He didn't greet her. He wasn't a man who indulged in pleasantries, but he was present. When Sedona punched the code into the gate, she would often see a curtain twitch in the library. When she returned from walking Atlas, she would find Levi standing in the foyer, examining a stack of mail he never opened, or staring at a painting he had passed 1,000 times. He was waiting. One Tuesday afternoon, the wind was particularly vicious. Sedona wrestled the heavy oak door shut, her cheeks flushed red from the bite of the frost. Atlas shook his coat, sending a spray of droplets onto the pristine floor. "You're freezing." The voice came from the drawing-room doorway. Levi stood there, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over a cashmere sweater that cost more than Sedona's rent for the year. He was watching her, his gaze fixated not on her eyes, but lower, on her hands, which were fumbling to unclasp the leash with stiff, frozen fingers. "It's just the wind, Mr. Harrington," Sedona managed, finally freeing the dog. She tucked her hands into her pockets, ashamed of their redness, of the rough, chapped skin that betrayed her life of manual labor. Levi, he corrected. It was a command, not an invitation. He walked toward her. He didn't stop at the polite distance of an employer. He invaded her personal space, bringing with him the scent of cedar and silence. He reached out and took her hand from her pocket. Sedona stopped breathing. His hands were warm, smooth, the hands of a pianist who protected his fingers from the world. He held her cold, rough hand in his, examining the calluses, the dry knuckles. It was a shocking intimacy, a collision of two universes, the one that polished silver and the one that dug in the dirt. "You need better gloves," Levi said, his thumb brushing over her skin. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hand as if it were a damaged instrument. "These work fine," Sedona whispered, her voice trembling. Levi looked up then. His eyes locked onto her mouth. He watched her lips move, intense and unblinking. It was a look that felt like a kiss, heavy and consuming, but there was something else in it, a desperate need for clarity. "Come," he said, dropping her hand abruptly. He turned and walked into the kitchen. It was a cavernous room of stainless steel and black granite, spotless and unused. A single copper kettle sat on the stove. Levi moved with a precise, silent rhythm. He poured water. He selected a tea bag from a wooden box. He was performing a domestic ritual, but he did it with the gravity of a funeral. Sedona stood by the island, feeling like an intruder in a museum. "Why are you still here, Levi?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could check it. "The city is full of noise. You said you hated it." Levi set the mug down in front of her. Steam curled into the air between them. "I don't hate the noise," Levi admitted, his voice rough. He leaned his hands on the counter, bringing his face level with hers. "I hate that I can no longer make sense of it. It's all static. Distortion." He tapped his ear, a gesture so subtle she almost missed it. "The music isn't gone, Sedona. It's buried under layers of cotton. I stay here because the silence is the only thing that doesn't lie to me." Sedona looked at him, realizing the magnitude of his prison. He wasn't just a recluse. He was a musician who was losing the very sense that defined him. The piano wasn't a friend anymore. It was a tormentor. We build fortresses to protect our wounds, not realizing that the walls we erect block out the light needed to heal them. "Atlas doesn't speak," Sedona said softly, reaching for the tea. "Maybe that's why you like him. He doesn't add to the static." Levi smiled. It was a small, fractured thing, appearing briefly before vanishing. "And you? You speak, Sedona, but you don't scream. You are the only quiet thing that comes through that door." The air in the kitchen grew heavy, charged with the unsaid. Levi was looking at her mouth again, reading the shape of her empathy. The distance between them, the employer and the help, the genius and the walker, was dissolving in the steam of the tea. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. For a moment, Sedona thought he would kiss her. She wanted him to. She wanted to bridge the gap between her poverty and his wealth, between his silence and her world of sound. But before he could touch her, the front door slammed open. The sound reverberated through the house, shattering the moment instantly. "Levi, are you downstairs?" A woman's voice, sharp, imperious, and echoing with entitlement. Levi flinched. The vulnerability vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a mask of cold, impassive stone. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. A woman swept into the kitchen. She was in her 50s, elegant in a way that felt like armor, pearls, tweed, and a gaze that assessed the value of everything it touched. This was Margaret Harrington, his mother, and the manager of the Harrington legacy. She stopped when she saw Sedona. Her eyes didn't widen. They simply cooled. She looked at the tea mug in Sedona's hand, then at Levi, and finally at Sedona's worn boots. She did the math in a second and dismissed the result as an error. "The dog walker," Margaret said, not asking but labeling. She turned her back on Sedona, addressing Levi. The trustees are calling, Levi. They need a decision on the spring gala. You cannot hide in this house forever. The foundation needs a face. Levi stood straighter, receding into himself. He didn't look at Sedona. He couldn't. I am busy, Mother, Levi said, but his voice lacked the fire it had held moments ago. It sounded muffled. You are drinking tea with the staff, Margaret corrected, her voice light but cutting. That is not busy. That is procrastinating. She turned to Sedona, flashing a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Thank you, dear. You can leave the mug in the sink. I'm sure you have other dogs to attend to. We have family matters to discuss. It was a dismissal. Brutal and absolute. Sedona felt the sting of it burn her cheeks. She looked at Levi, waiting for him to speak, to defend the moment they had just shared. But Levi was looking at the floor, his jaw locked tight. He was back in his cage, the leash handed over from the son to the mother. Of course, Sedona whispered. She set the mug down, untouched. The warmth was gone. She walked past Levi, past the woman who owned the air in the room, and out into the hallway. She collected Atlas's leash, her hand shaking, and stepped back out into the biting November wind, leaving the door to click shut on the silence she was never meant to disturb. December arrived not with a whimper, but with a suffocating blanket of white. A blizzard had buried Boston overnight, turning Beacon Hill into a snow globe frozen in time. The sounds of the city were muffled, swallowed by the drifts, creating a hush that felt less like peace and more like isolation. For Sedona, the snow meant struggle. It meant fighting the slush on the tee, drying wet paws with numb fingers, and navigating the treacherous, icy slopes of the sidewalks. But for the Harrington Estate, the snow was merely a decoration, a pristine, white backdrop for the annual winter solstice gathering. Sedona wasn't supposed to be there that evening. Her schedule ended at 4. But Atlas had fallen ill earlier in the day, a stomach issue that required a vet visit she had handled because Levi couldn't leave the house and Margaret wouldn't deign to put a dog in her Mercedes. Sedona had stayed with the animal until he was stable, bringing him back to the estate long after the street lights had flickered on. The house was ablaze with light. Chandeliers glittered through the frost-rimmed windows, casting long, distorted shadows onto the snow-covered lawn. Sedona keyed the code into the side gate, the one reserved for staff. She shook the snow from her coat, shivering as she stepped into the mudroom. The air inside was thick with the scent of pine, roasting meat, and expensive perfume. She led a drowsy Atlas to his bed in the laundry room, covering him with his blanket. She whispered a goodbye, her hand lingering on his head. She intended to slip out unseen. You're late. The voice was ice cracking on a lake. Sedona turned. Margaret Harrington stood in the doorway of the kitchen. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, diamonds glistening at her throat like shards of ice. She held a glass of champagne, her posture rigid with disdain. Atlas needed the vet, Sedona explained quietly, keeping her head lowered. I wanted to make sure he was settled. The dog is fine, Margaret dismissed, waving a manicured hand. My son, however, is occupied. We have guests. Important guests. The symphony board is here. Margaret took a step forward, closing the distance between the help and the mistress of the house. Levi is playing tonight, she announced, a cruel glint in her eyes. Sedona's breath hitched. He's playing. He has remembered his duty, Margaret said smoothly. He realized that hiding in the dark with a dog and the dog walker was beneath him. He needs to secure his legacy, and he needs a partner who understands the weight of that legacy. She gestured toward the double doors of the music room, which were slightly ajar. Go on, Margaret challenged softly. Look! Sedona shouldn't have. She should have turned and run back into the snow. But her heart, treacherous and hopeful, pulled her toward the light. She walked to the doorway and peered through the crack. The music room was full of people in tuxedos and gowns, holding their breath. In the center, bathed in the glow of the crystal chandelier, sat Levi. He was at the piano. He looked devastatingly beautiful, dressed in formal tails, his dark hair swept back. But his face was a mask of concentration, so intense it looked like pain. Beside him stood a woman. She was young, blonde, and poised, dressed in silk. She was turning the pages of the sheet music. She leaned close to him, her hand resting familiarly on his shoulder, tapping a rhythm he couldn't hear, guiding him. Levi's hands moved across the keys. The sound was technically perfect, a complex etude, but to Sedona's ears it sounded hollow. It was a performance of muscle memory, not soul. But he was doing it. He had returned to the world she couldn't enter. We tell ourselves that love is a bridge, only to find out it is a glass wall, transparent enough to see the other side, but strong enough to break us when we try to walk through it. As if sensing her presence, Levi looked up. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the adoring crowd, and locked onto the crack in the door. He saw her. He saw Sedona standing in her wet coat, her hair frizzy from the snow, looking like a smudge on a perfect painting. For a second, his hands faltered. A dissonant note rang out, sharp and ugly. The crowd murmured. The woman beside him leaned down, whispering something into his ear, touching his arm to steady him. Levi didn't look away from Sedona. His eyes were wide, pleading. He made a move to stand up, his hands lifting from the keys. Margaret appeared at Sedona's elbow. She didn't whisper. She spoke clearly, knowing her son was watching, knowing he was reading the scene, not the words. "He is looking at you because he is embarrassed," Margaret lied, her voice low and venomous. "He is humiliated that you are seeing him struggle. Do you want to ruin him, Sedona? Do you want to be the distraction that makes him fail in front of the people who can save his career?" Sedona froze. She looked at Levi. He looked desperate, but was it desperation for her? Or desperation to escape the shame of her presence? Margaret pulled an envelope from her clutch. "This is your final payment," Margaret said, thrusting it into Sedona's frozen hand, "including a generous bonus for the vet bill. Don't come back. For his sake." Sedona looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Levi. From across the room, Levi saw his mother hand Sedona the envelope. He saw Sedona take it. He couldn't hear the venom. He couldn't hear the lie. He only saw the transaction. He saw the woman he had led into his silence taking money to leave him in the noise. Levi's expression crumbled. The plea in his eyes hardened into a devastating resignation. He looked at the check in her hand, then looked her in the eye, and slowly, deliberately, turned his back on her. He placed his hands on the keys and resumed playing, the music louder, angrier, a wall of sound built to keep her out. Sedona felt her heart shatter. It wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, grinding destruction. "Goodbye," she whispered to the room that couldn't hear her. She turned and ran. She ran through the kitchen, past the sleeping dog she would never pet again, and out the back door. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The snow was falling harder now, erasing her footprints as soon as she made them. She stumbled down the alleyway, the envelope crumbling in her fist, the sound of Levi's piano chasing her down the hill. A perfect, beautiful, heartless melody that confirmed what she had always feared. She was just a visitor in his life, and visitors eventually have to go home. The silence that followed the winter solstice gala was not the peaceful quiet Levi Harrington had once courted. It was a vacuum. The guests had gone, the applause had faded into the snowy night, and the mansion on Beacon Hill had returned to its state of pristine, mausoleum-like stillness. But something had changed. The house felt larger, colder, and terrifyingly empty. Levi sat at the Steinway in the music room, the lid closed. He hadn't touched the keys since the night of the party. He stared at the black lacquer, seeing his own reflection, a man who had successfully performed the role of the genius heir, only to realize he hated the script. By his feet, Atlas lay with his head on his paws. The dog hadn't eaten in 2 days. He refused to go for walks with the agency walker Margaret had hired. He simply lay by the piano, letting out low, mournful whines that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into Levi's chest. "He's being dramatic," Margaret said, sweeping into the room with a stack of thank you notes. "Just like his owner. He'll eat when he gets hungry enough." Levi didn't look up. He was watching the dog. He saw the loyalty he had betrayed. "He's not dramatic, Mother," Levi said, his voice quiet but vibrating with a new, dangerous frequency. "He's grieving. He knows the difference between someone who feeds him and someone who sees him." Margaret paused, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. She placed the notes on the side table. "Well, speaking of the walker," Margaret sighed, a note of irritation in her voice. "It seems she has a flair for the dramatic as well. The bank called. The check I gave her, the severance, was returned by mail this morning. Torn in half." Levi went still. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "She returned it," Levi whispered. "She tore it up," Margaret clarified, sounding offended. "Foolish girl. She could have paid rent for a year. It just proves she was unstable, Levi. You're better off without that kind of chaotic influence." Levi stood up slowly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a jarring sound that he felt in his teeth. He looked at his mother. For 32 years, he had let her curate his life. He had let her filter the noise, manage the career, and edit the people who were allowed to get close. He had believed her when she said Sedona took the money. He had turned his back on the only person who made the static stop because he thought she had sold him out. But she hadn't. She had walked away with nothing but her dignity, leaving the money behind because her presence wasn't a transaction. "She didn't take the money," Levi said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow to the chest. "Levi, sit down," Margaret commanded, using the tone that had worked since he was a child. "You have a meeting with the conductor in an hour." "No," Levi said. He walked past her. He didn't run. He moved with the terrifying momentum of a glacier finally breaking free. He went to the hall tree and grabbed his heavy wool coat. "Levi!" Margaret shouted, the veneer of elegance cracking. "If you walk out that door, you are jeopardizing the spring season. You are risking your reputation." "My reputation is a ghost story you tell the donors," Levi said, opening the heavy oak door. The cold winter air rushed in, biting and real. "I'm going to find the living. We build glass walls to convince the world we are invincible, forgetting that the only way to touch the things we love is to shatter the very thing that protects us." He walked out. Atlas scrambled up, his nails clicking frantically on the marble, and squeezed through the door before it closed, refusing to be left behind again. Levi didn't call a driver. He walked. He walked down the hill, Atlas trotting by his side without a leash, guided only by the connection between them. They walked out of the cobblestone prestige of Beacon Hill and into the slush and grit of a city below. It took an hour to reach Alston. Levi's expensive shoes were ruined. His face was numb, but the static in his head, the constant, ringing tinnitus that plagued him, was quieter than it had been in years. He found the address from the employment file he had memorized months ago. It was a brick tenement building with a rusted fire escape and a door that didn't lock properly. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs, his heart hammering a rhythm that was frantic and uneven. He knocked on the door of apartment 3B. Silence. Then, the sound of a lock turning. Sedona opened the door. She looked tired. She was wearing an oversized sweater and thick socks. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. When she saw him standing in her hallway, wet, shivering, with a Doberman leaning against his leg, her eyes went wide. "Levi," she breathed. "You tore up the check," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation of hope. Sedona stiffened, gripping the doorframe. "I'm not a charity case, Levi. And I'm not a payoff. I didn't come to your house for the money." "I know." Levi stepped closer, the smell of damp wool and cold air clinging to him. "My mother told me you took it. She told me you left because you were paid to go. That's why I turned my back. I thought you were just another person managing me." Sedona looked at him, searching his face for the truth. She saw the snow melting in his dark hair. She saw the raw, unguarded pain in his eyes. "And now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you here now?" "Because the music stopped," Levi confessed, his voice breaking. "Not the piano. I can play the piano. I can hit the notes. But the feeling, the quiet, it walked out the door with you." He reached out, his hand shaking, and touched the doorframe near her head, boxing her in, not to trap her but to shield her. "I am deaf to the things that matter, Sedona," Levi whispered, the secret he guarded so fiercely finally spilling out in the hallway of a tenement. "I have 40% hearing loss in my left ear, and the tinnitus in my right sounds like a jet engine. The only time it stops, the only time the world feels clear, is when I am with you." Sedona's breath hitched. She looked at the man who the world thought was perfect, and saw the cracks he had been hiding. He hadn't rejected her because she was beneath him. He had pushed her away because she was the only one who could see he was broken. "You turned away," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "In the music room. You looked at me and you turned away." "I was a coward," Levi admitted, stepping into the threshold, invading her space with his heat and his sorrow. "I chose the safety of the cage because I was afraid you would see me fail. But I would rather fail in front of you than succeed for them." He looked down at Atlas, who was nudging Sedona's hand with his wet nose. "He wouldn't eat," Levi said softly. "He missed you. And I am starving, Sedona." The tension in the hallway was thick, heavy with the weight of the unspoken months. Sedona looked at the man who had walked through the snow to find her. She saw the choice he had made. He had left the mansion. He had defied the mother. He had shattered the glass. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she whispered, a spark of hope igniting in the cold. "It's not a mansion. It's drafty. And the radiator clanks." "Perfect," Levi breathed, stepping across the threshold of her world. "I've listened to perfect for too long. I want to hear something real." The apartment in Alston was small, cluttered with books and potted plants, fighting for the limited light of a single window. The radiator hissed and banged in the corner, a rhythmic, metallic clanking that would have driven the old Levi Harrington to madness. But the man sitting on the second-hand velvet sofa didn't flinch. Levi sat with his coat discarded on the floor, his shirt sleeves rolled up, watching Sedona move around the tiny kitchenette. She was making tea again. It was the same ritual she had tried to perform in his marble mausoleum, but here the steam rose up to fog the window pane, and the smell of chamomile wasn't swallowed by the sterile scent of lemon polish. It smelled like life. Atlas was sprawled on the rug, taking up most of the floor space. For the first time in weeks, the dog was deeply, peacefully asleep, his paws twitching in a dream of running through open fields. "It's not much," Sedona said, placing a chipped mug on the coffee table in front of him. She sat down on the other end of the sofa, pulling her legs up, guarding herself slightly. "The walls are thin. You can hear the neighbors arguing." "I can hear a television," Levi noted, tilting his head, listening to the muffled sounds through the plaster. "And a siren. And the wind." He looked at her, his gray eyes softening, shedding the last layers of the reclusive genius. "It's the first time in 3 years that the ringing in my ears has stopped," he whispered. "The static is gone, Sedona. The ambient noise of living, it cancels it out." Sedona looked at him, realizing the tragedy of his existence in the mansion. The silence he had paid millions to maintain had been the very thing amplifying his torture. He needed the mess. He needed the vibration of the world to ground him. "What about the piano?" Sedona asked gently. "What about the legacy?" "The piano will still be there," Levi said, tracing the rim of the mug. "But the legacy, that belongs to the Harringtons. I think I'm done being a Harrington. I'd rather just be Levi." He reached across the space between them. This time, there was no mother to interrupt, no gala to attend. He took her hand, the hand that had walked his dog, the hand that had torn up a check worth a year's rent, and pressed it to his cheek. "You left the door open," Levi murmured, closing his eyes against the warmth of her palm. "That night in the snow. You didn't lock it." "I was hoping the dog would come back," Sedona teased, though her voice was thick with emotion. "The dog followed his heart." Levi smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I just followed the dog." For years, Levi had believed that his isolation was necessary protection, a barrier against a world that expected too much from him. But looking at Sedona, he understood the lie he had been fed. We mistake the leash for safety, forgetting that the only thing keeping us from running wild is the fear that no one will come looking for us if we get lost. "I was lost," Levi admitted, opening his eyes to look at her. "I was running in circles in that house. But you came looking, Sedona. You were the only one who didn't look at the pianist. You looked at the man." Sedona moved then. She shifted across the sofa, closing the distance. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, burying her face in the curve of his neck, smelling the cold winter air and the expensive cedar cologne that was slowly fading, replaced by the scent of her own home. "You don't have to be perfect here, Levi," she whispered against his skin. "You can be off-key. You can be loud. You can be silent. Just don't be absent." Levi held her. He held her with a desperation that spoke of a man who had finally found his anchor. He realized that he didn't need to hear every note perfectly to understand the music. The most important melody was the sound of her breathing next to him, the beat of her heart against his chest, the quiet, steady rhythm of two people choosing each other over the expectations of the world. The seasons turned. The snow melted from the streets of Boston, replaced by the muddy promise of spring. The gossip columns ran stories for weeks about the disappearance of Levi Harrington. They speculated about a breakdown, a secret clinic in Switzerland, or a sudden retirement. They wrote eulogies for his career. But if they had looked closer, past the gates of Beacon Hill and into the crowded parks of the city, they would have seen a different story. They would have seen a man sitting on a park bench, wearing a worn coat, sketching musical notes into a notebook with a fervor he hadn't felt in a decade. They would have seen a massive Doberman chasing a tennis ball, barking joyfully at the squirrels. And they would have seen a woman with paint on her jeans sitting beside the man, sharing a sandwich, laughing at something he said. Levi didn't return to the concert stage. He didn't reconcile with the board of trustees. He sold the mansion, quietly, through an intermediary, and used the money to start a music program for children with hearing loss. He bought a small brownstone, one with thin walls and windows that opened to the street, where the noise of the city could wash over him like a tide. One evening, as the sun set over the Charles River, painting the water in shades of gold and violet, Levi sat at the small upright piano in their new living room. Sedona sat on the floor, leaning against his leg, Atlas asleep beside her. Levi played. It wasn't Mozart. It wasn't Chopin. It was something new, a composition that was raw, uneven, and hauntingly beautiful. It had pauses. It had silence. It had the chaotic joy of a dog barking and a radiator clanking. He looked down at Sedona. She looked up, her eyes reflecting the peace he had finally found. He realized then that love wasn't about finding someone who fit into his world perfectly. It was about finding the person who gave him the courage to break the world he was trapped in and build a new one. He stopped playing, letting the final chord vibrate in the air, unfinished and open-ended. "I love you," Levi said. He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough to be heard over the sirens outside, loud enough to be heard by the ghost of the boy he used to be. "I know," Sedona smiled, taking his hand. He spent a lifetime terrified of the silence, only to discover that the greatest symphony was not played in a concert hall, but in the quiet, messy, beautiful moment when his heart finally followed her home.